Hola mi gente, MsMalcolmHughes here, and today I'm coming to talk about chapter 1 of a book that I shared I was reading in my August read. So if you haven't checked that video out, go ahead, go over and check it out. But the book is Where Do We Go From Here? Community or Chaos by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I wanted to come and talk about chapter 1 of this book. I wanted to break it down that way because I think that this book is not only super important as it gives us a different perspective and different angle into the thought process of Dr. King, but he also does a brilliant job of really slowly walking us through a lot of the early stages of the civil rights movement, where we are collectively as a people, as a nation, as a movement. When he writes this book, it's important to note that he does write this book writes the majority of it while taking a reprieve in Jamaica. So he does go away from the US in order to really gather his thoughts, really escape, and really be able to focus on his thoughts, what he wants to share, and what will ultimately be his final work. So let's get right into it. Chapter 1 is Where Are We? I'm going to read the first paragraph to really position us into where we are in the civil rights movement and what he will ultimately break apart for us. On August 6, 1965, the president's room of the Capitol could scarcely hold the multitude of white and Negro leaders crowding it. President Lyndon Johnson's high spirits remarked as he circulated among the many guests whom he had invited to witness an event he confidently felt to be historic, the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The legislation was designed to put the ballot effectively into Negro hands in the South after a century of denial by terror and evasion. That is important, that's setting in that context, because he talks about, as you can see here, clearly displayed, he talks about the unity, right? He talks about Negro leaders, white leaders, and how they've all joined together at the White House to celebrate the passing of what Dr. King would say has taken collective work, right? Has taken collective advocacy from both whites and blacks alike. One thing I want to say before I get more into that, and how those two groups, specifically others, but he really focuses on Dr. King's approach is really a dichotomy, black and white. But a big question becomes, who is Dr. King writing to and who is he writing for? So here, it's not like today where you have social media and you can really go out and say what you want and get at the targeted groups you want to address. In this work, he had to try to write to everyone, and that's a challenge. And so some places here, and I'll talk about this when I do my final review of the entire book, but some places here, it's easy to be frustrated or argue that he should have pushed more, or that can't be directed toward this particular audience. But the reality is, he's trying to do a lot in this one book. And with chapter 1, Where Are We? He really focuses on the fact that collectively, this is where we are as a nation with civil rights. This is what it took for us to get here, right? At this point, when he's talking about the signing, this is what it is taking for us to get here. We had to work together. And now there are two critical issues that have come up that he'll unpack throughout the rest of the book, but he really begins to divulge in chapter 1. One is the fact of the white backlash. And one thing I can say is, one thing I find so intriguing, and which makes reading history so important, is the reality that nothing is new. Terminology is recycled. The emotions of people are not new. They come back full circle. And if you have not read history, then you don't know. Anyone who's ever had a prolonged conversation with me knows I have a soapbox topic, and that topic is that I think that the majority of people, especially here in the United States, view everything ahistorically. We approach situations as if this is the first time, as if there is not an entire world out there of events that have happened that are comparable to ours where we can learn valuable lessons. When he talks about white backlash, It's so important because this is something that we're grappling with today. And let me explain for you what white backlash is. How Dr. King explains it is that it is when the support of white people hits a critical mass, and then there is a backlash of resistance where they're saying, haven't you progressed enough? Haven't we done enough? At this point, you're complaining, you want too much. And we've seen that time and time again where people are aware or tapped in for a second, for a moment, and then they tap back out, right? And we've seen that with Black Lives Matter. We've seen that during COVID when there was the collective protest, right? So we've seen moments where it bubbles up and then people fall back and it fizzles and people go back to their lives, but those who are impacted are still suffering and still fighting because true progress has not been made. Another thing that I deeply appreciate with this book is when he discusses laws and policies that are put into place as an act of appeasement. And what I mean when I say that is we see this to this day, where there'll be an event, something tragic will occur, it will get national attention. People will then create policies, regulations, a number of written proposals that are created to change the situation. However, what Dr. King argues, and which I agree with, is that then becomes the change, which it's not. But people treat it as if it is, because after that point, people forget and nothing more than that happens, right? So that act of appeasement then becomes as if it is the actual implementation and change, which again, it's not. So then you have this continuous cycle where nothing is actually changing, but there is written policy that says that the change has been created, but there is no follow through, there's no actual implementation. Therefore, the situation doesn't improve. The people who are suffering are still suffering. And there just creates this lag and then this resentment because nothing has actually changed. But then those in power can say, hey, we created this bill, we created this policy, provided new regulations, but they're not effective because no one does the hard part. The creation of these initiatives is the easy piece. And that was happening even here. So he talks about how you have this voting rights bill, right? But now there's white resistance, there's backlash, and there's not that follow through. There's no longer the same support to ensure that it's actually taking place. Love that, because it's relevant. Listen, we got to go back and get history, right? We have to go back and read our history and know our history. We have to learn from our ancestors who've already put in so much work, who've already done so much study, whose blood, sweat, and tears have gone into ensuring that we are better equipped today. We have to go back and get this knowledge so that we are not again and again starting from ground zero when there's so much foundation that has already been laid. And that's what we see here. So that first chapter, Where Do You Go, is really laying out that one problem, right? Which again is relevant today. And the other problem, which really builds or helps to build what he'll continue to unpack in chapter 2, but we'll talk about that in his own video, is the frustration, anger, and resentment of Black people, right? So what eventually will become the Black Power movement. So he argues what has occurred to get Black people there, right? That white backlash, where you're not following through, we're not seeing actual change, right? Our situation is not improvement. Yeah, we've come far, but not far enough. You haven't continued your support, right? And he argues that those white liberals or individuals who were fighting against other whites in power who were abusing it, or Klansmen or police chiefs, right? These openly bigoted and racist individuals, how the whites who were fighting against them eventually realized that they have more in common with them than with the oppressed. That's a word. And so with that, they rescind their support. They go back to their lives. They fall back in with those who they have more in common with than continuing to fight and advocate for the liberation of those oppressed. And so he argues that with that, then you get Black frustration, you get Black anger, you get Black resistance that then ultimately becomes that push for the Black power movement that white people argue that they are fearful of. And he also goes further to argue that, and I think it's an argument that many have made, is that this irrational fear that if Black people are in positions of power or an equal footing, that Black people will inflict upon white people what they've done to them, just isn't accurate and isn't true. But he does argue, even though he doesn't agree with it, I will have to say that Dr. King holds strong to his position of nonviolence, right? And he argues why. He argues that deeply and eloquently in chapter 2, but we're not there yet. So in chapter 1, he lays that foundation, and that kind of takes us through the rest of the book. I haven't finished it yet, but I did want to come in and really discuss chapter 1 because I think it's important, and I think this is the type of work that should be unpacked chapter by chapter, because each chapter is a different theme, and it really allows me to unpack it more and discuss it more with you all here. So those are my big takeaways for chapter 1. I think that Dr. King is trying to do a lot. He's speaking to multiple audiences. So he's on one hand trying to make clear to white people why Black people are frustrated, where white people are failing, but then he's also speaking to Black people in saying that nonviolence is the answer. We cannot resort to the behaviors of those who are oppressing us to seek our own liberation. In the words of Aju Lord, the master's tools cannot be used to dismantle the master's house. Do I fundamentally agree with the arguments of Dr. King? Yes and no, right? So I'd say one thing reading this book is, for me, it's like intellectual gymnastics, because I don't 100% agree with Dr. King in the sense that I'm not a proponent of nonviolence. I'm not. I fall more in the school of thought of Malcolm X, hence the name MsMalcolmHughes, where we are nonviolent with those who are nonviolent with us. If someone touches you, make sure that you're the last person they touch. That is me ad-libbing, freestyling that last part, but you know what he said. I don't agree with just allowing someone to abuse you and for you to be peacefully resisting. However, I do think Dr. King is right in the sense that you cannot become the thing that you hate. You cannot become the thing that is oppressing you and destroying you. So though I don't agree with nonviolence, I do agree with the argument that using violence to try to get people to change their minds and their hearts and their thoughts is probably not the way, right? That's not going to get us there. So I do agree with that. And I think that's the piece for me where I say it's an intellectual, like tennis match, or an intellectual match, in the sense of, though I know what my core beliefs are, it is challenging me to reflect and think on the other side. Like, my best friend is a pacifist. I'm not. But we've had many of arguments and debates about that, and just discussions about it, right? I think it's important for us to see the other side. So I do agree that, like, we cannot allow brute force evil to change us. But I also, you know, my grandmother taught me, if you can't take a lick, don't give one. Keep your hands to yourself. So with that, it's a lot to ponder and a lot to think about. And that's just what I wanted to come and share. So as I'm continuing to read this book, I will hopefully come and share each chapter so that we can really unpack what's being shared here and really analyze how it still impacts us today, the lessons that we could take away, the arguments that are included, and what we can really learn. And so that's what I wanted to share. I'm not gonna give my final overview because I'm not done with the book, but I think that if we are looking for Dr. King at his most, I would say his furthest point of intellectual thought, right? This is his last work. So if we're considering where he is at the time of his passing, how his intellectual thoughts may or may not have changed and grown over the time of his life and his work in the civil rights movement. I think this is the best work we have to analyze that. So I think it's useful. I think we should all read it. I think we should all learn from it. So I hope that you all will check it out with me. If you haven't heard of it, please check it out. If you have heard of it but haven't read it, take it off your to read list. And if you're currently reading it, let me know below your thoughts and your opinions. And if you've read it before, still let me know your thoughts and your opinions. As always, I am MsMalcolmHughes, one who believes that books are sometimes better than people. And until the next one, I hope that you all continue to give time to be kind to each other, and to have the best day of your life on purpose each and every day. Os amo, adios, ciao, peace.